Elias was a man defined by the sea and the rust that came with it. A third-generation trawler captain operating out of the jagged coast of Maine, he was fighting a losing battle against rising fuel costs and a boat that seemed determined to fall apart. His vessel, the Gray Horizon, was currently docked with a seized main winch, the mechanical heart of his operation. Without a winch to haul nets, he couldn't fish, and without fishing, he couldn't afford a new winch. It was a cruel paradox that led him to an industrial liquidation auction 3 towns over. The auction was selling off the remnants of a defunct shipyard that had once serviced government research vessels. Elias wasn't looking for treasure. He was looking for scrap. He spotted Lot 404, a colossal hydraulic net winch from the 1970s, stripped from a vessel named the R/V Chimera. It was a monstrosity of iron and grease, seized by decades of neglect, and weighed over 5 tons. The bidding was virtually non-existent. The winch was too heavy for most scrappers to move and too old for modern ships to use. Elias won the lot for the price of the scrap steel alone, a calculated risk. He knew that even if the winch itself was unfixable, the massive electric motor driving it would contain hundreds of pounds of industrial-grade copper wiring. If he stripped it down, he could sell the copper to pay for the repairs on his own smaller winch. It was grueling, dirty work, but it was the only option he had left. He used his flatbed truck, groaning under the weight, to haul the iron beast back to his barn, a drafty wooden structure filled with the smell of diesel and salt. The first day was spent just trying to penetrate the outer shell. The casing was built to withstand the crushing pressures of the deep ocean and the corrosive salt spray of the North Atlantic. Elias went through a dozen grinding discs just cutting the rusted bolts off the main housing. The winch seemed to fight him at every turn, the metal groaning as he pried plates loose. It was a lonely, frustrating task, chipping away at a relic of the Cold War while his bills piled up on the kitchen table. He was a fisherman on dry land, a sailor without a sea, reduced to a scrap merchant in his own shed. He focused his efforts on the electric motor housing, a cylindrical unit the size of a wine barrel, bolted to the side of the drum. This was where the money was. Copper prices were high, and a motor this size should yield a significant payout, enough to keep the lights on for another month. Hey guys! Before we crack this motor open and see what's inside, we have a huge request. We are incredibly close to hitting 10,000 subscribers, a milestone we've been chasing for years. If you enjoy these stories of incredible discoveries, please smash that like button and subscribe right now to help us cross the finish line. It really helps the channel grow. Also, we want to know who is watching. Drop a comment below and tell us what country or city you are watching from. We love seeing our community map. And if you're feeling generous, check out the Super Thanks button to support our next salvage adventure. Now, let's get back to the Chimera's winch. By the second afternoon, Elias had finally exposed the armature of the motor. He was covered in black grease and rust flakes, his muscles aching from wrestling with the heavy steel. He expected to see the dull, reddish-brown glint of old copper windings, perhaps coated in darkened varnish. What he saw instead was confusing. The windings were there, thick coils of wire wrapped tightly around the core, but they were coated in a thick, black, rubberized insulation that he hadn't seen before. It looked more like military-grade waterproofing than standard electrical insulation. It made sense, he reasoned. The Chimera was a research vessel, likely operating in extreme conditions. He took his utility knife to slice through the black insulation to get to the copper underneath. He needed to verify the quality of the copper to estimate his earnings. He pressed the blade into the thick rubber and sliced a 3-inch strip, peeling it back. He stopped, frowning. Underneath the black rubber, the wire wasn't the characteristic orange-red of copper. It was a dull, grayish-white. His heart sank. Aluminum. Sometimes, cheap industrial motors used aluminum wiring instead of copper to save weight and cost. Aluminum scrap was worth a fraction of copper. If this entire 5-ton beast was wound with aluminum, he had wasted his time, his fuel, and his money. He would barely break even on the scrap steel. Frustrated, He grabbed a file from his workbench. He needed to be sure. Sometimes tinned copper looked silver on the outside but was red in the middle. He ran the file hard across the thick wire, expecting to see the pink flesh of copper reveal itself under the friction. He filed once, twice, 3 times. The metal remained a stubborn, brilliant silver white all the way through. It was soft, but dense. He filed deeper, cutting a notch into the wire. It wasn't aluminum. Aluminum was light and brittle. This metal felt heavy, substantial, and it didn't oxidize or flake. It gleamed with a lustrous white fire under the harsh light of his workshop lamp. Elias paused, the file hovering in his hand. He had stripped hundreds of motors in his life. He knew copper, he knew aluminum, and he knew steel. This was none of them. The wire was heavy, unnaturally heavy. He cut a 6-inch segment of the wire with bolt cutters, struggling against the density of the material. When the piece fell into his hand, it felt like he was holding a lead fishing weight, not a piece of wire. He wiped the grease off the segment and held it up to the light. It wasn't magnetic. It was impervious to the acid in the battery tester he used for checking connections. Elias looked at the massive motor, containing thousands of feet of this wire, and a strange, cold feeling washed over him. He wasn't looking at scrap. He was looking at something that didn't belong in a scrapyard. Elias stood over the workbench, the 6-inch segment of wire resting heavy in his palm. The silence of the barn was broken only by the howling wind rattling the corrugated metal roof, but in his mind the gears were turning with frantic intensity. He knew metals. He knew the specific weight of steel, the malleability of copper, and the lightness of aluminum. This material defied his daily reality. It was too soft for steel, too heavy for aluminum, and the color was wrong for everything else. He needed confirmation before he let hope take root. He reached for a propane torch he used for soldering pipe fittings. He clamped the mysterious wire into a vise and ignited the blue flame, holding it directly against the metal strand. If it was aluminum, or even a cheap tin alloy, it would melt or deform within seconds. The flame roared, heating the metal to a glowing cherry red, but it did not run. It did not drip. When he removed the heat, the metal cooled rapidly, returning to its lustrous silver-white state without a single mark of oxidation or charring. This was a noble metal. It was chemically inert and possessed an incredibly high melting point. Paranoia began to creep into the edges of his mind. He looked at the barn doors, ensuring the heavy wooden latch was dropped. If this was what he suspected, the rusty winch was no longer a piece of scrap, it was a target. He needed a spectral analysis, but he couldn't walk into a jewelry store with a chunk of industrial wire without raising questions he couldn't answer. He thought of Old Man Miller, a recluse who ran a high-end salvage yard 2 counties over. Miller specialized in aerospace scrap and electronics. He possessed a handheld XRF analyzer, a gun-like device that used X-rays to determine the elemental composition of any alloy. Elias wrapped the sample in an oily rag, shoved it deep into his coat pocket, and climbed into his battered pickup truck. The drive took an hour, every mile feeling longer than the last. He kept checking the rear-view mirror, an irrational feeling of being watched settling over him. When he arrived at Miller's yard, the old man was busy stripping gold pins from 1980s server boards. Elias didn't make small talk. He placed the heavy wire segment on the counter. Miller picked it up, his eyebrows knitting together immediately at the density. He didn't ask where it came from. In their line of work, discretion was the currency. He simply picked up the XRF gun, pointed the nozzle at the gray metal, and pulled the trigger. The device hummed for 10 seconds, calculating the atomic signature. When the screen beeped, Miller stared at it for a long time. He wiped his glasses and ran the test again. The result was identical. He looked up at Elias, his expression grave. He turned the screen around. It read, PD 99.9%. Palladium. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. Palladium was a precious metal, part of the platinum group, used in catalytic converters and high-end electronics. It was rarer than gold and, depending on the market, often more valuable. But it was never, ever used as bulk wiring. It was too expensive. A single ounce could be worth over $1,000. The motor in his barn contained coils that were thick as his thumb and wound in layers deep into the core. He wasn't looking at ounces. He was looking at hundreds of pounds. Miller did the rough math out loud, his voice dropping to a whisper. If the motor was fully wound with this gauge of solid palladium wire, Elias was in possession of a fortune that exceeded the value of the entire fishing fleet in the harbor. The winch wasn't just valuable. It was a manufacturing anomaly, a mistake, or a deliberate secret worth tens of millions of dollars. Miller offered to buy the sample on the spot for $2,000 cash. Elias refused, snatching the wire back. He needed to get home. The drive back to the coast was a blur of adrenaline. Elias realized the R/V Chimera hadn't just been a research ship. It must have been a testbed for experimental propulsion or detection systems during the height of the Cold War. Palladium had unique properties for hydrogen absorption and electrical conductivity in specific environments. The Navy must have commissioned a money-is-no-object prototype, likely for silent running or magnetic invisibility, and then, through bureaucratic incompetence or lost records, the ship was decommissioned without the specialized nature of the winch being recorded. It had sat in a government boneyard for decades, disguised as rusty iron, waiting for a fisherman to buy it for pennies. Back in the safety of the barn, Elias locked the doors and reinforced them with a heavy steel bar. He approached the winch with a newfound reverence and terror. He began to dismantle the motor housing with surgical care, terrified of damaging the soft metal inside. As he peeled back the outer steel plates of the stator, he found a stamped metal tag riveted to the inner chassis, previously hidden by the external casing. It wasn't a standard manufacturer's plate. It was stamped with the logo of a defunct defense contractor and the words, Project Silent Deep, Mark IV Prototype, Classified Material, Destroy upon Decommission. The date was 1974. The winch wasn't just valuable. It was technically classified technology that should have been incinerated 50 years ago. Elias was dismantling a ghost. He worked through the night, fueled by coffee and the manic energy of discovery. As he cut deeper into the windings, extracting the heavy silver coils, he hit something hard embedded in the center of the copper-colored resin core. It wasn't metal. He used a chisel to carefully chip away the hardened varnish. Buried in the center of the motor, wrapped in lead foil and beeswax to protect it from the heat of the operation, was a watertight cylinder. The engineers who built this motor had hidden something inside the very heart of the machine, something that was never meant to be found unless the motor was destroyed. Elias pulled the cylinder free. It was heavy, sealed with a complex locking mechanism that hadn't seen the light of day since the Nixon administration. He realized the palladium wire was just the housing. The real secret was inside the cylinder. The millions of dollars in wire were just the wrapper for something far more dangerous. The watertight cylinder sat on Elias's workbench, a silent monolith amidst the chaos of stripped metal and grease. It was constructed from a dull, gunmetal gray alloy, completely seamless except for the complex, recessed locking mechanism on the top cap. It was heavy, dense, and cold to the touch. Elias wiped the remaining layer of beeswax and varnish from its surface, revealing etched serial numbers matching the ones on the hidden chassis plate, Silent Deep. He knew that brute force with a sledgehammer would likely trigger a fail-safe or destroy the contents. He opted for a precision approach, using a high-speed diamond-tipped drill bit to carefully bore through the locking pins. It took 2 agonizing hours of slow drilling, constantly applying cutting oil to keep the heat down, before the mechanism finally clicked. With a sharp twist of a pipe wrench, the cap unscrewed, releasing a hiss of pressurized inert gas that had preserved the interior for half a century. Inside, there was no gold or jewels, but something far more volatile in the wrong hands. Elias extracted a tightly rolled bundle of documents sealed in heavy, transparent mylar and a smaller, velvet-lined box. He opened the documents first. They were blueprints, stamped "Top Secret" and "Eyes Only," depicting not a winch, but a towed sonar array system designed for extreme depth acoustic monitoring. The schematics detailed the motor he had just dismantled. The winch was actually a deployment system for a prototype listening device meant to track Soviet submarines under the polar ice cap. The text explained the anomaly of the wire. The motor required Category 1 palladium alloy for its windings to eliminate all electromagnetic interference, ensuring the motor ran with absolute magnetic silence. Standard copper created a magnetic field that sensitive mines or enemy sensors could detect. The palladium alloy, seemingly insanely expensive, was the only material that offered the necessary conductivity with zero magnetic footprint. The government had literally built a motor out of precious metal to achieve invisibility. Elias unrolled the final document, a manifest. It listed the production cost of the single motor unit in 1974 dollars as $1.2 million. Adjusted for inflation and the current skyrocketing price of palladium, the scrap metal sitting in his barn was worth over $4.5 million on the open market. But the second object, the velvet-lined box, changed the equation entirely. Inside was a heavy machined key made of titanium and a set of coordinates stamped onto a metal card. The documents referenced a Site B, a secure underwater cache where the actual sonar arrays were stored. The winch was just the key to retrieving them. The Navy had lost track of the winch during the chaotic decommissioning of the shipyard, effectively losing the physical means to access a stockpile of classified Cold War technology that was likely still sitting on the ocean floor or in a sealed bunker. Elias realized he was at a crossroads. He could melt the palladium wire down into ingots, creating a massive fortune that would be difficult to launder without attracting the IRS or the FBI. Or he could use the leverage he now possessed. He held the physical proof of a lost government asset and the raw materials that constituted a federal fortune. He spent the next 3 days in a fever state, finishing the extraction of the wire. He worked until his hands were blistered and raw. When he was finished, he had accumulated 380 pounds of high-purity palladium wire. He stacked the coils in the bed of his truck, covering them with old fishing nets and crab pots to conceal the gleam. The sheer weight of the precious metal made the truck's suspension sag. He didn't drive to a scrapyard. Instead, he drove to the capital, to the office of a maritime attorney named Sarah Jenkins, a woman known for handling salvage claims against the state. When Elias placed a single coil of the wire and the classified blueprints on her mahogany desk, her professional demeanor vanished. She locked the office door and closed the blinds. She understood immediately what Elias had found. This wasn't just salvage. This was a national security recovery. The motor belonged to the U.S. Navy, but under the law of abandoned property and specific maritime salvage conventions, Elias had a rightful claim. However, simply selling the wire would be considered theft of government property since the item was never officially declassified, just lost. The path to the money wasn't through the smelter. It was through the front door of the Pentagon. Jenkins drafted a letter not to a scrapbroker, but to the Department of Naval Research and the Treasury. The proposal was bold. Elias would return the classified blueprints, the titanium key, and the palladium wire, which was technically strategic material, in exchange for a full salvage award. Maritime law allowed for a reward of up to 50% of the asset's value if the recovery was voluntary and the asset was in peril. By proving the winch was sold as scrap due to clerical error, Jenkins argued that Elias had rescued the strategic stockpile from being lost to the commercial market or foreign actors. They were gambling that the Navy would pay millions to quietly recover their embarrassing mistake and the valuable palladium, rather than letting a fisherman sell their secrets and their metal on eBay. The wait was excruciating. Elias returned to his small coastal cabin, hiding the truck in the deep woods behind his property, sleeping with a shotgun by his door. He was a millionaire on paper, but in reality he was broke, terrified, and guarding a fortune that could send him to prison or change his life forever. A week later, a black government sedan, not a police car, rolled slowly down his gravel driveway. 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They didn't have handcuffs. They had a briefcase. The gambit had worked. The Navy didn't want a public spectacle about how they accidentally sold a multi-million-dollar stealth prototype for scrap value. They wanted to make a deal. Elias walked out to meet them, the salt wind blowing through his beard, ready to negotiate the sale of the century. The interaction in the driveway was tense, a silent standoff between the solitary world of a Maine fisherman and the rigid hierarchy of the federal government. The agents, identifying themselves only as contractors for the Office of Naval Intelligence, did not arrest Elias. Instead, they asked to see the materials. Inside the barn, the atmosphere shifted from potential conflict to clinical verification. One of the agents, a man with calloused hands and a demeanor that suggested engineering experience rather than law enforcement, spent an hour testing the palladium coils with his own advanced equipment. He inspected the dismantled motor casing, the hidden compartment, and finally, the blueprints. When he picked up the titanium key and the coordinate card, his professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a look of genuine relief. The recovery of the metal was financial, but the recovery of the key was clearly operational. They convened in Elias's small, wood-paneled kitchen to discuss terms. Sarah Jenkins, who had arrived shortly after the agents, managed the negotiation with shark-like precision. The government's position was complex. They acknowledged that the Winch had been sold legally through their own surplus auction, granting Elias clear title to the physical materials. However, the intellectual property, the blueprints and the technology implied by the key, remained classified defense secrets. They offered a deal that was less of a purchase and more of a retroactive service contract. They would pay Elias the full market value of the palladium, classified as a strategic material buyback, which amounted to $4.8 million. But there was a catch. They wouldn't just take the key, they needed Elias to use it. The agents revealed the true nature of Site B. The coordinates pointed to a shallow, treacherous underwater canyon known as the Devil's Gullet, a rocky graveyard for ships located 20 miles offshore. The Navy had installed a passive sonar array there in the 70s, powered by radioisotope thermoelectric generators, nuclear batteries. The array had gone silent decades ago, but the nuclear material was still down there, potentially leaking into the fishing grounds. The winch Elias had bought was the only compatible recovery mechanism for the specific docking collars on the submerged units. Furthermore, the area was geographically impossible for a modern naval salvage ship to navigate without drawing massive attention or risking grounding on the razor-sharp shoals. They needed a local vessel with a shallow draft and a captain who knew the currents of the gullet intimately. They needed the gray horizon. Elias was given a choice: hand over the key and face a lengthy legal battle over the classification of the palladium, or accept an immediate payout and a lucrative government contract to take his own boat back out to sea one last time to recover the nuclear batteries. It was a dangerous request. The gullet was notorious for rogue waves and unpredictable tides. But the thought of his local waters being poisoned by rotting Cold War tech gnawed at him. He agreed. The deal was signed on his kitchen table. The agents immediately mobilized a team. Within 12 hours, flatbed trucks arrived not to take the scrap away, but to bring equipment in. For the next 2 days, Elias's barn became a secure forward operating base. The agents, now revealed to be a specialized recovery unit, worked alongside Elias to reassemble the winch. They didn't rebuild the motor. They replaced it with a modern hydraulic drive brought in by the team, but the drum and the specialized cable spooling mechanism were refurbished and mounted onto the deck of the Gray Horizon. The old trawler, usually smelling of fish guts and diesel, was fitted with military-grade sonar, radiation detectors, and a portable crane reinforcement system. Elias watched as his rusting livelihood was transformed into a covert recovery vessel. He used a portion of his advance payment to settle his debts and perform emergency repairs on the boat's engine, ensuring the Gray Horizon could handle the strain of the heavy lift. On the third morning, under a heavy blanket of pre-dawn fog, they set sail. The crew consisted of Elias at the helm, 3 recovery specialists, and the heavy, refurbished winch dominating the aft deck. The journey to the Devil's Gullet was treacherous. The sea was chopping violently, gray waves slamming against the hull. Elias navigated by memory and instinct, threading the needle between submerged granite spires that would have torn a larger Navy ship apart. The tension on the bridge was palpable. The specialists watched their radiation counters, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the diesel engine and the creaking of the hull. When they arrived at the coordinates, the depth sounder showed a jagged abyss beneath them. The current was ripping through the canyon, making it difficult to hold a stationary position. Elias had to actively pilot the boat against the surge, fighting the wheel to keep them directly over the target. The team deployed a remote-operated vehicle, ROV, to locate the submerged array. On the monitors, the grainy image of the ocean floor appeared. There, half buried in silt and ghost nets, sat the silent deep listening post, a series of dark metallic spheres anchored to the rock. The ROV manipulated the titanium key Elias had found, inserting it into the master locking mechanism of the central sphere. On the deck, the winch groaned as it took the tension. The cable went taut, vibrating like a violin string. This was the moment of truth. If the winch failed, the cable could snap and decapitate anyone on deck. If the gray horizon wasn't stable enough, the weight of the waterlogged sphere could capsize the trawler. Elias pushed the throttle forward to counter the drag, the old boat shuddering under the strain. Slowly, inch by inch, the winch began to pull. The rusty drum, originally bought for scrap, was now performing the job it was designed for 50 years ago. Dark, silty water churned behind the boat as the object rose from the depths. The radiation alarms on the deck gave a low, warning chirp, confirming the presence of the nuclear batteries. They were bringing a toxic ghost to the surface, and the entire operation rested on the structural integrity of a winch Elias had saved from the smelter. The winch screamed, a high-pitched mechanical whine that cut through the roar of the wind. The hydraulic pressure gauges were redlining, the needle trembling at the very limit of the system's tolerance. Elias stood at the helm, his knuckles white on the wheel, fighting the violent surge of the ocean that threatened to smash the gray horizon against the submerged rocks of the gullet. The trawler was listing dangerously to the stern, pulled down by the immense deadweight of the waterlogged sphere rising from the deep. Every bolt in the hull groaned in protest. The Navy specialists on the deck were strapped into safety harnesses, soaked by the freezing spray, their eyes locked on the dark water churning off the fantail. They knew that if the cable snapped now, the whiplash would cut them in half, and the nuclear payload would tumble back into the abyss, likely cracking open and poisoning the coast forever. For 20 agonizing minutes, the battle between the rusty winch and the ocean continued. It was a test of 1970s engineering against the raw power of the Atlantic. Then, a dark shape breached the surface. It looked like a sea mine from a nightmare, a sphere of black metal encrusted with strange, albino deep-sea barnacles and draped in decaying kelp. The radiation counters on the deck spiked, their urgent alarms nearly drowned out by the storm. The sphere swung wildly in the air as it cleared the water, a pendulum of nuclear death. Elias feathered the throttle, expertly timing the roll of the waves to match the sway of the load, allowing the crew to guide it into the reinforced cradle they had welded to the deck. With a final, thunderous clank, the sphere settled. The locking clamps were thrown. The winch, its job finally done, fell silent, steam rising from its overheated hydraulics. The journey back to the harbor was a slow, tense procession. The gray horizon sat low in the water, carrying a payload that technically didn't exist. When they finally broke through the fog and entered the calm waters of the bay, the dock was waiting. It wasn't the usual quiet scene of lobster boats and seagulls. A military transport convoy had locked down the pier. Men in hazmat suits were waiting with a lead-lined containment transport. A crane, far larger than anything the local fisherman had ever seen, lifted the sphere from Elias's deck and placed it gently into the waiting truck. The operation was surgically precise. Within an hour, the convoy was gone, the sphere was gone, and the secret of the Devil's Gullet was on its way to a secure facility in the Nevada desert. Elias was left standing on the dock, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Sarah Jenkins was waiting for him in the warm cab of her car. She handed him a thick envelope. Inside was the final settlement documentation. The government had adhered to every letter of the agreement. The payment for the recovered palladium wire was processed as a strategic material acquisition. The payment for the recovery mission, the hazard pay, the boat rental, and the consulting fee was processed separately. The total deposit, which would hit his bank account the next morning, was $6.2 million. He stared at the number, the zeros stretching out across the page. It was more money than 10 generations of his family could have made fishing the hard way. But Elias didn't retire to a tropical island. The sea was in his blood, and the gray horizon was his home. He used the fortune to do exactly what he had set out to do at the very beginning, but on a scale he had never dared to dream. He pulled the trawler into dry dock for a complete refit. The hull was reinforced, the engine replaced with a top-of-the-line modern diesel, and the electronic suite was upgraded to the best civilian technology available. He became the most capable independent salvage operator on the eastern seaboard, no longer desperate for scrap, but hunting for history. As for the Winch, the giant, rusty beast that had started it all, the Navy attempted to confiscate it as part of the classified system. Elias, however, had negotiated a specific clause in his contract. He kept the main housing of the Winch. He had it sandblasted, repainted in its original industrial green, and mounted it proudly on the new aft deck of the Gray Horizon. He didn't use it to haul nets anymore. It was too powerful and, frankly, too sentimental. It sat there as a monument. He replaced the palladium wire with standard copper, making it functional again for heavy salvage lifting. Every time he looked at that winch, he was reminded of the thin line between junk and treasure. He had walked into an auction looking for a few $100s of copper to survive, and he had walked out with a fortune and a saved legacy. The locals still whispered about how Elias got so rich so fast. Some said he found pirate gold, others said he caught a mermaid. Elias never corrected them. He just smiled, patted the cold steel of the winch, and set his course for the horizon, ready for the next storm. The ocean held many secrets, and he now had the means and the winch to find them. Thanks for watching this incredible journey. If you enjoyed this story of hidden value and high-stakes adventure, don't forget to like and subscribe. The world is full of treasures disguised as rust. You just have to know where to look.